Today we're going to learn about clauses. Get it? Yup, pun totally intended. A clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb. Now there are two different types of clauses, independent and dependent. Independent clauses are complete sentences. They express a complete thought and can therefore stand by themselves. Dependent clauses, on the other hand, still contain a subject and a verb, but they do not express a complete thought, which means they can't stand by themselves. You can remember that independent clauses can stand by themselves because America has its independence, meaning it can stand by itself as a free country. Nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, oh my! Dependent clauses can function as any of these three parts of speech. Dependent clauses start with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Here's a list of subordinating conjunctions, and yes, there are plenty of them. Take a moment to read through the list. Don't worry, there are only a few relative pronouns, making them much easier to remember. So now you know that dependent clauses contain a subject and a verb but cannot stand by themselves. You also know that they begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Let's take a look at some examples. Crabs have a thick armored shell which protects them from danger. In this sentence, the dependent clause is underlined. It contains a subject, which, and a verb, protects, but it cannot stand by itself. I could not walk up to someone and say, which protects them from danger. Well, I could, but people would probably think it a bit odd. In addition, it starts with a relative pronoun, the word which. Remember that pronouns replace nouns, so it is not uncommon for a relative pronoun to stand as the subject of a dependent clause, like in this case, where which is the subject, replacing the noun shell. Let's move to the second example. When crabs hunt, they hide in crevices and use their claws to snap at prey as it swims past. When crabs hunt is the dependent clause in this sentence, and you'll notice it's right at the beginning. Dependent clauses can be included at the beginning, middle, or end of a sentence. The subject of this clause is crabs, and the verb is hunt. However, it cannot stand by itself, which is of course what makes it a dependent clause and not an independent clause. I cannot say, when crabs hunt, by itself. Finally, this dependent clause begins with the subordinating conjunction when. Now, look at the third example. Did you know that there are over 6,700 species of crab? The dependent clause, that there are over 6,700 species of crabs, begins with the relative pronoun that. The subject of this clause is the word there, and the verb is the word are. Now, it might look like this clause could stand by itself. After all, I could walk up to someone and say, there are over 6,700 species of crab. But this is actually a common trap. When you ask yourself if a clause could stand by itself, you must include the subordinating conjunction or relative pronoun which introduces it. Then it becomes easy to tell if it's a dependent or independent clause. I can't walk up to someone and say that there are over 6,700 species of crab, and therefore this is a dependent clause. Remember when we said that dependent clauses can function as adjectives, nouns, or adverbs? Next, we're going to learn how to identify each type, beginning with adjective clauses. An adjective clause is a type of dependent clause used as an adjective in a sentence. Your biggest clue is that adjective clauses immediately follow the noun they describe. So here are some examples. Note that the adjective clauses are underlined. Did you hear about the lady who almost got eaten by a shark? The bathing suit that she was wearing was the color of a seal, which sharks hunt for prey. I know a place where we can snorkel without fear of sharks. So the test you're going to use is to draw an arrow to the noun before the adjective clause and ask yourself if the clause is telling you more about that noun. Take a look at the first example. Notice that the clause begins with a relative pronoun, who. Now draw an arrow from the clause, who almost got eaten by a shark, back to the noun right before it, lady, and ask yourself, does this clause tell me more about the lady? Yes, it does. It tells us which lady, the one who almost got eaten by a shark. This example brings up another common trap when identifying dependent clauses. It would be easy to think that this clause could stand by itself. I could certainly ask the question, who almost got eaten by a shark? But you cannot change the form of this statement when asking yourself if a clause could stand by itself. In other words, you can't change the clause from a statement to a question in order to make it make sense. If you read it as a statement, who almost got eaten by a shark, it cannot stand by itself. Now look at the second example. Draw an arrow from the adjective clause that she was wearing, which begins with another relative pronoun, back to the noun right before it, suit. Does this clause tell us more about the swimming suit? Yes. Do the same with the second adjective clause in this sentence. Draw an arrow from which sharks hunt for prey back to seal. Does this clause tell us more about the seal? Yes. Finally, the adjective clause in the third example, where we can snorkel, begins with a subordinating conjunction, where. Draw an arrow back to the noun right before it, place. Does this clause tell us more about the place? Why, yes. Yes, it does. Next, let's learn how to identify noun clauses, a type of dependent clause used as a noun. Noun clauses most commonly begin with the word that, or a WH type word, like who, what, when, where, or why. A simple test to identify noun clauses is to replace the clause with a pronoun, like it or that. If it makes sense, it's a noun clause. Let's try it out in the sample sentences. How dolphins navigate and hunt is fascinating. If we replace the underlined clause with the pronoun it or that, we get it is fascinating or that is fascinating, both of which make sense. Move to the second example. Scientists have learned that dolphins use echolocation to bounce high-pitched sounds off of objects. If we replace the underlined clause with that, we get scientists have learned that, which makes sense. And finally, take a look at the third example. This way, they can tell where their next meal is. Replace the underlined clause with that, and you get this way, they can tell that. This test will only work with noun clauses. Finally, we'll learn how to identify adverb clauses, a type of dependent clause which functions as an adverb. Remember that adverbs can modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs, so this makes adverb clauses a bit more difficult to test for. The easiest way to identify an adverb clause is simply to use process of elimination. If it isn't an adjective clause and it isn't a noun clause, it must be an adverb clause. However, there are still a few clues. Adverb clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions and are followed by underlying sentences. In other words, sentences that could stand by themselves if the subordinating conjunction wasn't there. Let's practice. Sea turtles have lived since dinosaurs roamed the earth. Notice that the adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, since, and is followed by an underlying sentence, dinosaurs roamed the earth. Now, to prove this is an adverb clause, we can use process of elimination. If this was an adjective clause, there would be a noun immediately before it. Is the word lived a noun? No, it is a verb, so we know that this can't be an adjective clause. Okay, now let's test if it's a noun clause. What happens if we replace the clause with a pronoun, like the word it? We get the sentence, sea turtles have lived it. That doesn't work either, so we know that this must be an adverb clause. Move to the second example. Unfortunately, sea turtles are more endangered than you would like to believe. Look at the word right before the clause, endangered. Is endangered a noun? No, so this cannot be an adjective clause. Now try replacing the clause with a pronoun. We get, unfortunately, sea turtles are more endangered it. That doesn't make sense, so this can't be a noun clause either, which proves that it must be an adverb clause. Finally, look at the third example. However, because they spend most of their lives in the water, it is difficult to track their numbers. Is the word however a noun? No, so this can't be an adjective clause. Can you replace the clause with a pronoun? If we said, however, it is difficult to track their numbers. Does it make sense? Nope, so this can't be a noun clause, which means by process of elimination, it must be an adverb clause. Now that you've learned all about independent and dependent clauses, let's learn about clause combos, or in other words, sentence types. There are 4 ways to combine independent and dependent clauses. Number 1, a simple sentence, which just contains one independent clause. Number 2, a compound sentence, which contains 2 or more independent clauses. Number 3, a complex sentence, which includes one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. And finally, number 4, a compound complex sentence, which includes 2 or more independent clauses plus at least one dependent clause. Here is a simple sentence. Blue whales are the largest animals in the world. It has a subject, whales, a predicate, are, and it expresses a complete thought. So it's just one independent clause. Here's an example of a compound sentence. Blue whales are the largest animals in the world, yet they eat one of the smallest animals in the world, krill. In this sentence, there are 2 independent clauses surrounding the word yet. Here's an example of a complex sentence, which remember includes only one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Blue whales, which weigh up to 200 tons, are the largest animals in the world. Which weigh up to 200 tons is the dependent clause here, surrounded by the independent clause. Blue whales are the largest animals in the world. Finally, here's a compound complex sentence. Blue whales, which weigh up to 200 tons, are the largest animals in the world, yet they eat one of the smallest animals in the world, krill. It contains two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause.